welcome to the second half of today's program, Perspectives on the Transition from Capitol Hill. I'm Jamie Hedlund. I'm responsible for ICANN's relationships with the U.S. government. And right now I'd like to briefly introduce the panelists, and then we can move quickly to the discussion. So immediately to my left is Jeff Farah, who is counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, where he advises Chairman John Thune and Republican members of the Committee on Communications, Technology, and Internet Policy. Previously, Jeff served as general counsel to U.S. Senator Scott Brown, advising on international trade, telecommunications, intellectual property, technology, and sanctions. Before joining the Senate, Jeff was an attorney at a leading Washington, D.C. law firm specializing on international trade matters. Next to Jeff is John Branscombe. He's senior counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Previously, he served at the U.S. Federal Communications Commission as deputy chief of the agency's Wireline Competition Bureau. He also previously served as counsel for communications and intellectual property matters for U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar. Prior to joining the FCC, he worked as an associate at a law firm in Washington, Wilkinson, Barker, Nauer. Next, on the House side, David Rettel is chief counsel of the majority staff of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee of Energy and Commerce. In this role, he is a principal advisor to the chairman as well as the subcommittee chairman on communication and technology matters. Prior to joining the Energy and Commerce Committee staff, he served as a director of regulatory affairs at CTIA, the Wireless Association, an international trade association of the wireless communications industry, where his work focused on policy issues involving wireless technology, spectrum, broadband, and regulatory mandates. And then finally, we have David Goldman, who's been the chief counsel for the U.S. House Communications and Technology Subcommittee since January 2015. Before that, he served as senior legal advisor for FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. Prior to serving on Capitol Hill, David served in a number of positions at the FCC, including in the office of former chairman Julius Genachowski. Before that, he served as a staff law clerk at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit in Chicago. So those are our panelists. The format will be as follows. I will ask questions. There'll be jump balls, so anyone on the panel can answer them. And if we have time, we'll have Q&A at the end. All right. So first to talk a little bit about history and background. The first question, why and since when does Congress and your committees care about Internet governance in general and the IANA stewardship transition in particular?
I guess I'm happy to lead off. I mean, as we heard from Ira before this, Congress has been involved in Internet governance since the beginning. So it's no surprise that at this juncture when the IANA transition is being considered that we are involved once again. On this go-around, we got involved late in the 113th Congress, which was last year, and started off at the very beginning of the IANA process with the first cut of what became the .com Act, the Domain Oversight through Continued Oversight Matters Act. Very early on in that process, it was a bill born out of the number of questions that members of the Energy and Commerce Committee had about the IANA transition and what it would mean, particularly for U.S. domestic interests. We held a number of hearings on the issue, and we had a lot of back and forth, very good back and forth with both ICANN and NTIA, and with stakeholders that are part of the process that we've all seen play out over the last year or so. And ultimately, that led this Congress to a revision of the .com Act, and I was happy to work with my colleague David Goldman, who sits on the other side of the aisle from me, to come up with a version of the .com Act that passed the House earlier this year. It actually passed while we were a lot of us were in Argentina for the last ICANN meeting with 378 yays out of the 435 House members. So Congress has always played a role in this process. We're continuing to do so, and we're really pleased with the progress we've made sort of on the domestic issues within the legislative branch.
Could any of you talk a little bit about Congress's involvement in global internet governance? So apart from the IANA transition, other issues involving internet governance more broadly.
Well, no, I mean, certainly, we have taken an interest over the past few years. We were in Wicket together. We were in Dubai together. So this, certainly international internet governance issues is something that's important to our members, and setting other than the IANA transition. So we have taken a role. But is that your question? Or
I was also hoping you might talk a little bit about the sort of the bipartisan support for any particular position on internet governance.
Well, I would just say with regard to the IANA transition, for the Senate's purposes, it started with an oversight letter from Chairman Thune and 34 other Republican colleagues, and then at the beginning of the 114th Congress, Senator Thune got involved with the accountability work stream to try and back specific proposals, and then ultimately we had an oversight hearing which Assistant Secretary Strickling and Fadi Shahade testified at, and then we ultimately moved the .com Act through our committee.
Jamie, to get to what you were to your point about bipartisanship on a number of issues, we've also, beyond the IANA work that's been done, there have been a number of other things in global internet governance. John mentioned the work that both our committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House did on ITU work to stay involved in what's going on in the ITU sectors as part of their discussion of issues that are tangential to internet governance, right? The availability of spectrum for radio services that access the internet, the work that's done on the ITU-T side to deal with landing licenses and those sorts of things. And that has always been a bipartisan effort as well on Capitol Hill. And then more recently, you all got to be on the receiving end of other areas of our interest when ICANN rolled out the GTLD program, which was also an area where we all worked together in the House at least. I try not to speak for the Senate, but in the House, between House Energy and Commerce and House Judiciary, on making sure that went forward in a process that comported with what the legislative branch believed was the best efforts for the U.S.
But I will add, so just on internet governance issues, it is amazing that at least the House and the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, have always spoken with one voice in support of the multi-stakeholder approach to international internet governance. So I think
that was what I was, because I know at ICANN we've been huge supporters of that.
And we disagree. The four of us disagree on quite a lot of things domestically, but this is one issue which is actually quite nice that all our bosses are actually united. So.
I would say it's if not the least, one of the least contentious issues for our committees.
Yeah, I could say, in my experience being here since January, when we have hearings dealing with these issues, if you didn't see where the different members were sitting physically in the room, you wouldn't know which side of the aisle they were on. It's been uniform, and everyone has been working together. It's been great.
All right. Terrific. Okay, so next question. Explain, if you can, your committee's relationship to NTIA, who's obviously a big player in all of this.
Both of our committees are the so-called authorizing committees for the Department of Commerce and NTIA, and so we have general oversight role over NTIA.
Okay.
That means, as a practical matter, that means, NTIA's governing statute, the NTIA Organization Act, was promulgated by our committee. It is amended by our committee when there's amendments made in the Congress, and we regularly conduct oversight over their activities. So we have a very good working relationship with NTIA. It's only strengthened by trips like these where we have a chance to coordinate with them as U.S. citizens, not necessarily as legislative branch versus the executive branch of the U.S. government. And so in general, we've despite the fact that we are often portrayed as their overseers, we have a very collaborative and collegial relationship with NTIA.
All right. You mentioned the .com Act. Somebody mentioned the .com Act earlier. There's a number of bills that have been floated in this Congress, last Congress, dealing with the transition, including the .com Act, including a spending bill that would seek to block the transition from taking place. Do you have any perspectives on any of these bills? Do you think any of them will have an impact or could have an impact, will have an impact?
I think you find that generally authorizing committees prefer to do the business that's within the sphere of that committee, and so our preference would be to conduct oversight and speak from a congressional perspective through items like the .com Act rather than through policy writers.
So just so people understand, authorizing meaning authorizing the work of the Department of Commerce of actually creating the policies as opposed to the committees who make spending decisions.
Correct. So the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Senate Commerce Committee are the two authorizing committees, and our view is that those are the appropriate committees to be speaking on these issues. There are times when the appropriations committees need to get involved, but certainly at this juncture we think we're conducting a significant amount of oversight, as I mentioned, through letters, hearings, the .com Act, and of course several of us here at this meeting, and so we feel as if we're doing what needs to be done.
Yeah, I think just to explain for anyone who doesn't know, it's generally there's two different committees that can deal with an agency. There's the one that kind of deals with, I think, the authorizing committee that deals with the policy, and then there's the other committee that deals with the money. And in our view, I think, as the people who we think should be dealing with the policy, we don't normally like it when the other committee comes in and tries to use money to enforce their policy that they want. So I think from our perspective, I can speak for the members I work for, we see the .com Act as an alternative to anything that was going through the appropriations process.
Yeah, the authorizing appropriating relationship was once described to me when I got to the Hill as the authorizers define the cup and the appropriators tell you how full to fill it. And in this case, sometimes the appropriators decide the correct fill level is 0.
They wish they had our jobs.
Well, of course, but the reality is, obviously, .com was originally a product of Energy and Commerce, so I will say we feel some pride of ownership for our members in that bill. We're very proud of the way it turned out in the House and the vote that we had, and so that is obviously our preferred course.
So for our Senate staffers, any willingness to handicap the chances of .com getting out of the chamber?
We're certainly working very hard to effectuate that.
Okay, great. Okay. Jeff, your boss and Senator Brian Schatz, both original Senate co-sponsors of the .com Act, recently sent a letter to ICANN Chairman Steve Crocker. I don't know that everyone's seen it here, but I was wondering if you could, you mentioned the letter that your boss and Senator Rubio sent back in July of 2014. You've stayed interested in this the whole time. What should we take away as the main messages from this, your most recent letter?
Well, Chairman Thune has been involved and up to date on this process throughout, and given the timing of what's going on with the transition and the discussions, he felt like this was an appropriate time to try and again state what he would like to see out of a transition, and that is to have a bottom-up process that results in robust and significant accountability reforms and that guards against government capture. Those are the types of things that he'll be looking for and that I believe a lot of members of the Senate will be looking for when a proposal is ultimately put forward. And certainly on this issue of government capture, it's been something that he has been weighing on his mind for the entirety of the transition. You mentioned in 2014 he and Senator Rubio weighed in on specific reforms, and it was at that time that he said that he wanted to see it in the bylaws that only GAC advice by consensus would be considered by the board. That's certainly something that we'll be actively watching those proceedings.
That's great. Well, you anticipated my next question, which is, what do you all hope to see in the final proposals to the extent that you're...
I would certainly reiterate what Jeff said. My boss has also felt very strongly, and we've said it at many of our hearings, that there are sort of a couple things that we want to see out of this. One is we're going to want to see compliance with the NTIA criteria. And recently, as a result of the process that started in the 113th Congress, we got a report back from the U.S. Government Accountability Office that discusses sort of the domestic policy aspects of the IANA transition. One of the recommendations they made was that NTIA have a process in place that can be looked at and scrutinized for how they're going to analyze this. My understanding is that NTIA is in the process of doing so, which we view as a really positive development.
So using a really standards-based review methodology for evaluating the proposal.
Yeah, so I mean, we're really hoping to see a rigorous analysis of whatever proposal is put in front of NTIA. I would, again, reiterate what Jeff said about the role of consensus in the GAC. If we are talking about a multi-stakeholder system, then we have to actually be talking about a multi-stakeholder system where only those groups that have produced consensus are able to bring something up. That's a very important aspect for us as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I could say, I mean, the point, just to follow up on the point about consensus, I think that that's completely consistent with the positions that the Democratic members in the House have taken so far. I think what the members that I work for, I think what they'll be looking for is that it's what we get back is something that still supports the multi-stakeholder approach, has broad consensus, and definitely has, I mean, strong accountability is going to be very important to everybody.
I would associate myself with the remarks of my colleagues. I think we're fairly united on that, right? So, yeah.
All right. Okay, so last question is sort of a hypothetical. Let's say we get to the end of this process. The proposals are submitted to NTIA. The proposals go through the chartering organizations. They get approved. They go to NTIA. NTIA finds that they meet the criteria and then sends them up to Congress for approval. And let's say that for whatever reason there's concerns about the proposal, like the Congress, someone thinks that there is a potential for capture, for example. If that were to happen, what do you have any sense of what Congress could or would do if?
I mean, I think that's why we're here, is that we want to be involved in observing this process and coordinating and working with NTIA now. And when we were at BA, and certainly since they've announced the IANA transition, we're hoping to try to avoid at all costs that happening. And so I would be hard-pressed to imagine that we could get all the way through the process here in the multi-stakeholder system, the process of review at NTIA, and just then have these issues come up. Being involved at this stage means that we're being heard, and we're seeing that play out. The things that our bosses have raised in hearings are being addressed. You know, a lot of the stress tests that are being done as a part of this process were things that were raised in hearings at Energy and Commerce and at Senate Commerce. And so I can't imagine that hypothetical coming to fruition. I think if there's going to be some concern from members of Congress, there's certainly plenty of time between now and the time that a proposal is out the other end of the NTIA process for concerns to be aired.
That's great to hear. I mean, go ahead.
I would agree with that. I mean, look, we are in close contact with NTIA. We are attending these. We're over here with you guys, right? So I think we will keep, I don't think we would be surprised by anything. I guess to the larger community, I would challenge all of you to work really hard to come together to present a plan that Congress cannot disagree with. So.
All right. Thank you very much. That's all for my questions. We got time for a handful of questions. There are mics in the aisles if anyone has any burning questions on a Sunday evening.
I have a quick question. It's Killian from Dublin. How much of the bipartisan atmosphere and environment is down to ignorance from the legislators? And what I mean by that is that perhaps, I'm speculating here that one of the reasons that there has been agreement on the internet is because the politicians don't understand what it is.
I don't think that's the case with the committees of jurisdiction. I mean, certainly we've spent a lot of time, our personal time, educating the membership of our committees about what ICANN is and what it isn't, what multi-stakeholderism is and isn't. And so the members of our committees are very well informed on both sides of the aisle. I'll admit once you get out past the committee's jurisdiction, perhaps the understanding falls off a little bit, but that's frankly true of any issue.
That's frankly the reason for the committee system in
Yes.
Congress, is so that members with jurisdiction over the issue can get educated on the issues and present a straightforward process for getting there. And to double back on what I said, that's why we're here. I mean, we're here to help our bosses. Our bosses can't be everywhere, unfortunately, so we're here to help make sure that we see what goes on here and can report back to them what's happened.
But I would also say, I mean, that's also, we've had a number of hearings, at least in our subcommittee, on this, where we bring in very educated witnesses. Fadi's been there a number of times, Larry Strickling's been there a number of times, and the way those hearings have been going, they're not partisan showcase affairs. They are educational. And the members have been very interested and dig into the issues, and I think they're fairly well educated on it.
And for that matter, when we've brought in witnesses for our hearings, it's not just, don't get me wrong, we like Assistant Secretary Strickling and Fadi well enough, but we've also brought in stakeholders. We had Intel at a hearing. ISOC has been at a number of our hearings. We've had groups that are all part of this process come in to speak directly to our membership and tell them exactly what's going on, exactly what they should care about. So.
Yeah, it would make my life a whole lot easier if there was more ignorance, but unfortunately. Anyway, any other questions? Oh, sorry, yes, sir.
I've got two questions for you guys. The first is, how concerned are your bosses with the possibility of the Ted Cruz amendment to the .com Act, which would require a prerogative approval by Congress, getting included in the legislation that finally comes out of the Senate-House reconciliation process? And my second question is, again, what are your feelings, or can you express what you think your boss's feelings are with regards to the probability of this whole transition effort getting sucked up into the vortex of the 2016 election cycle, given that at least two of the Republican potential candidates have come out in opposition of this so far?
All right, so two questions. One, Cruz amendment. Two, the interaction between the proposals and the presidential campaigns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, with regard to Senator Cruz's amendment, Senator Cruz is a member of the Commerce Committee, and he worked through our markup process to offer an amendment in good faith. And I think that Senator Thune certainly, acknowledges some of his concerns, and he went through the process, offered his amendment. That amendment ultimately failed, and the amendment, the version that was reported out of our committee, was identical to the version of .com that passed the House of Representatives, and that's the version that we'll be trying to pass and have been trying to pass. With regard to the 2016 election, I assume you're referring to Senator Rubio and Senator Cruz. Senator Cruz has some concerns about the IANA transition, and certainly those are well publicized. I think Senator Rubio is not quite in that position. If I don't want to characterize his position too much, but he's certainly been involved in a lot of internet governance issues going back to, I think, the 112th Congress. And so how much this gets caught up in the 2016 politics, I don't know. There's no shortage of issues that are out there for people to talk about, and so you will have to wait and see.
All right.
Good afternoon, Christopher Wilkinson. Thank you for your wisdom and your remarks. Historically, I was partly responsible for the present balance between the multi-stakeholder system in ICANN and including the government's advisory role. Basically, I set this up in Europe with IRA magazine in the United States at the time. All I would like to say is that from what you say, some of your members are being unnecessarily alarmist about government capture. That is not the issue. Yesterday, Fadi gave a lecture about including capture. The problem of capture is multi-stakeholder. You've got to have a balance throughout the system, throughout the organization, including commercial and industrial participants. So please cool this down. There is no risk of government capture. There is a very healthy balance between governments and the rest of the multi-stakeholder system and that should continue, and I ask you to support it.
I would just, in response, say I think we all are in agreement with you, that we think the system, the balance that exists now between governments and other stakeholders in ICANN is an appropriate balance. And I wouldn't characterize my bosses as alarmists, because I'd lose my job. But besides that, I think there's real concern, and that concern should be addressed. And I applaud everyone in the multi-stakeholder community for the work they're doing to address those concerns, founded or otherwise.
Thanks. Steve.
Thanks. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice and a member of the Cross Community Working Group, and I've been privileged to be a witness in some of the hearings that you've held. And I want to certainly correct any perceptions in this room that, judging by the questions asked by your bosses, that there's a lack of awareness. Because I would encourage anyone to attend a meeting or two with congressional staff as they drill into hundreds of pages of detail and ask every witness a lot of questions long before the cameras are running in the hearing room. And the report language that these gentlemen put together to support everything that comes before their committees reveals an in-depth understanding of the internet that I would challenge any other government to match. And this is despite the sketchy reputation we have in America of having a Congress that can't get anything done. But I'm glad to say that when we do something, we seem to do it rather well in the case of what you guys have all done. So I applaud your efforts and acknowledge how hard it was for you to stay focused and to avoid ladening the .com Act with specific little fixes or tweaks or what a special interest might have come to you and asked you, can't you just put this in? To your credit, you've resisted all of that. The .com Act is so clean and it endorses NTIA's requirements verbatim, and then it says to the community, we back the community. If we come up with the consensus recommendations for the transition as well as the accountability part, well, then Congress is in a position to endorse the transition. That's the most help you can be. And finally, on the notion of capture, you don't know how right you are worrying about capture, but it's not necessarily some notion that governments will take over. But it's the notion that if the governments change the way they make decisions, and they're allowed to do that, well, then these new advice that comes over would embroil ICANN into trying to work out a mutually acceptable solution between some governments who were for the advice and a whole lot of other governments who were against it. So it's a disaster, I think, to put ICANN's board in a position of negotiating between governments who have sovereign powers and want to have their interests respected. I think it's very wise to pay attention, as you have, of avoiding in a situation where if governments move to something less than consensus, that their contentious opinions don't embroil ICANN or capture ICANN into a process of working out a negotiation among governments. ICANN doesn't do that. Maybe the UN does, so let them worry about that, but don't make ICANN into a mini UN to work out differences among governments. Thank you again for all your effort.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll respond to Steve a little bit too. Steve, thank you and for your kind words, and thank you for your sage testimony when you come to the committee. We come from a body where the two sides of an argument fail to reach consensus, we don't get to have any output. If the House and Senate can't agree on language in a conference, as it turns out, we don't get to put it forward to the president. So we certainly can understand the frustration that brings, but that process is what we are used to living with.
All right, last question.
Hi, my name is Jordan Carter. I'm one of the rapporteurs on the CCWG process. And one of the downsides or upsides of that means that you get stuck in a lot of detail. A lot of meetings. And you guys have a very different perspective coming from outside, from a kind of political governmental context. So the question I would find it really interesting to know the answer to is, in observing this process so far and where we've got to, what have you found most surprising in the conclusions that we've reached?
So, speaking from the high level, as you said, not the details, I actually think the whole process has been impressive. I mean, it's the people in this room, you've done an incredible, you've made so much progress. It's been such a great job, and I mean, as we were hearing, we're so far along, and I think just I don't know, the multi-stakeholder approach is a little overwhelming when you first approach it, and to see how well that everybody has been able to get there, I think. So again, to your description, and we're at the high level rather than the details, and I'll avoid getting into details. I think just the progress has been really impressive.
I think for me, the most surprising thing is, I mean, we get paid to sit in meetings and work out policy decisions. Most of the people that participate in this process, this is a side gig, and in some cases an unpaid side gig. And I think the most impressive thing to me, the most surprising thing, is the level of passion and the level of involvement from folks that don't necessarily have skin in the game other than being internet users. I think that's the most surprising thing to me, and it has been throughout my involvement in the ICANN process. This isn't my first ICANN meeting, and every meeting it seems to be more and more impressive how many people are involved and care and want to be a part of this process. That's the most surprising thing to me.
All right. Okay, now this is really the last question.
Thank you. And I think I need to speak in English because even if we have the interpretation, you don't have the headset to... yeah, you can read, but it's not the same thing that to use the good tools we have in this organization to have the interpretation. And thank you. Your last words was very interesting because I think we need to take into account in all that end user, and I am one of them here in this organization, and I think those 3 billion users need to know where we will go and how we will go. And I have sometimes the impression, today I have the impression that, sorry guys, but I don't understand what you are, how you are organized. I am not a US citizen, I am not, then a lot of things you are telling us to do, we have trouble to understand why we need to do that. Because at the end of the day, what it's important is that the world agree on what we want to do. Okay, but the last one who will say it's a Congress? I was thinking that it was something else, it was a community that need to be agreed on. Then my question is how you want to reconcile that, because the impression I have here is that you will be the last one, your organization, the Congress will be the last one to have a say. That's my first question. My second recommendation, you need to talk with the government, with the GAC, because the community working group on accountability will not be the right place to negotiate what the government advisory committee has right to do within this organization. If you have requests, then I hope that you will convince the GAC that they will agree with your request. Don't ask the end user to be in the middle of that, because it's not our role. Thank you.
I mean, I'm happy to chat. I don't think that any of us seem to believe that Congress has the last say in this, but it is an interesting thing for the worldwide multi-stakeholder community to get a small vision into the intergovernmental process of the United States. Because ultimately what's happening here is there's a process that's occurring in the multi-stakeholder system, but there's also an intra-US government process that's going on. And I don't envy him this role, but Assistant Secretary Strickling is sitting right in between those two processes. And it's a very difficult place to be, and like I said, I don't think any of us want his job right now. But there is a process that he has to go through within our own government that includes being responsive to the authorizing committees on Capitol Hill that ultimately fund his agency. And so I don't think I would characterize it as the United States Congress having the last say in the multi-stakeholder system. However, we do have an affirmative oversight role over NTIA. And that has what has been our role in this process writ large. And I think we've been pretty clear, my members have been pretty clear in reiterating that whenever we have a hearing, that our job is to oversee NTIA, and NTIA's job is to be the multi-stakeholder representative at these events. I don't, for one, want to be the one to represent the U.S. government in the multi-stakeholder system. I don't think that that would necessarily be the most productive use of my time. But being here to make sure that we are seen and heard as a part of this decision is absolutely a part of what we do.
That makes sense. All right. Jeff, John, David, and David, thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming today.